Welcome back, everybody. I hope everyone's refreshed after having had a coffee or a drink of water. My name's Tom Hart. I'm a senior research fellow in the public finance team here at ODI. In this session, following the kind of opening and talking about some of the fiscal pressures that many countries have been facing, we're going to be discussing how ministers of finance can effectively design and deliver fiscal consolidation packages. And I'm delighted that we've got four excellent panelists here to discuss this issue. So presenting first, we'll have Daniel Ndarangu, who is the country lead and head of programs at the Institute of Public Finance in Kenya. And he has a wealth of experience across public policy, decentralization, participatory governance, and public financial management. Following Daniel will be Luke Iro. Luke is division chief in charge of regional studies in the African department of the International Monetary Fund. He supervises the work on the regional economic outlook for sub-Saharan Africa and has been mission chief across a number of different countries in West Africa and Botswana as well. Before joining the IMF, Mr. Iro worked as a civil servant at the French Treasury, which is a bit of a theme because we also have Delphine Moretti, who's the lead in financial management and budgeting in the OECD's public management and budgeting division. And prior to the OECD, she worked at the IMF and the French Ministry of Finance and the Cour des Comptes, which is the French Supreme Audit Institution. Finishing us on the panel will be Dr. Kay Brown, who's the Executive Secretary of the Collaborative Africa Budget Reform Initiative. For those of you who don't know CABRI, it's an intergovernmental organization that provides a platform for peer learning and exchange for African ministers of finance, budget and planning. And I think given the emphasis that we just heard in the first panel about the importance of peer learning across ministers of finance, we're very happy to have Kay with us here today. Kay holds a PhD in economics from the University of Cape Town. She lectured at Nelson Mandela University and subsequently joined the South African National Treasury, where she headed the budget planning unit. And she's also been the chief executive officer of a constitutional institution in South Africa that monitors and advises on equity in government budgets. Before we start, I'm just going to give a quick guide to the panel on what people are going to be talking about. So Daniel is going to kick us off talking about the fiscal squeeze facing the government in Kenya. Luke will then give us a broader picture looking across the IMF's work across Africa and looking at the reforms that needed to address the current fiscal challenges. Delphine will then take us through some of the challenges that governments in the OECD have been facing in maintaining spending control. And finally, Kay is going to talk about some of her experiences from South Africa and what this tells us about the kind of politics and tactics of spending control. But to kick us off, let's turn to Daniel. Daniel, Kenya is facing quite a fiscal squeeze at the moment. Back in April, the president's chief economic advisor made the news after he tweeted that debt service is consuming 60% plus of revenue. Liquidity crunches come with the territory. When maturities bunch up or revenues fall short or market shift, something has to give. Salaries or default, take your pick. So is that the choice Kenya is currently facing? And please tell us a bit more about the fiscal pressures that Kenya is facing and the decisions the government is taking to deal with it.
All right. Thank you very much, and good morning. I'm happy to be here presenting a case for Kenya and as an example of what is going on in the global south in fiscal squeeze. And the quote you've read from the economic advisor is really sets up us up on where we are, because for a long time until 2019, we deferred consolidation, making our deficits grow up to around 25% of the revenues, and that has continuously increased up to about now eating about 50% of government revenue. So it is very clear that the increasing budget deficits, more borrowing, debt servicing has taken us to a position where we have to rethink the attempts of fiscal consolidation. So in these few minutes, I want to reflect a bit on how the deferred fiscal consolidation has been in Kenya, how that has affected service delivery, what attempts the government is making, and some policy alternatives that can be taken by the government as we move towards this. The context we're operating in is there's an increase in demand for government services. As perhaps you could be aware, 5.4 million Kenyans faced acute food insecurity that is unprecedented in 2023. So it meant that the government had to step in with social transfers. We're giving safety nets to the vulnerable population, and amidst that, still repaying or doing debt service. So we also have very high pressure on the Kenya shilling, depreciating against the dollar and other major currencies, and noting also that about 60% of our debt is dollar denominated. So, and looking at how far we've come, in 2014, we took the first commercial Eurobond of $2 billion. The maturity of that is coming in 2024 at a rate of 6.9%. At the time that debt was being procured, the Kenya shilling to dollar exchange rate was about 116, and now is at upward of 150. So it means that we also are going to incur more to pay for for the commercial debt we had incurred. So looking at this sustained accumulation of fiscal deficits, there's a trend where the fiscal deficit increased over the last decade to about, those are in Kenya shillings, about 934 billion Kenya shillings, about 8%, which was the highest. But over the last 2 fiscal years, there's an attempt to reduce fiscal deficits, with the current one standing at about 6%. However, the in-year budget changes that happen during supplementary budgets usually pushes these deficits even higher, because the pattern is to increase expenditure within the year and reduce or use very optimal estimates of revenue. So the deficit even grows wider within in-year budget revisions. So if with the ineffective attempts to cut down on expenditure, then also the falling short of revenues, it means that the fiscal deficits every year are increasing. And as you can see, the debt service as well, because those deficits have to be financed. The debt service proportionate to the share of the government revenue, expenditure, and GDP, all of them are in an upward trajectory. Looking at the debt service as a percentage of revenue, increasing over the last 4 years by about from 36% to 49%. The debt service to GDP also remaining at 70% and increasing to 8% in 2022-2023. So it's in relation to the tweet that we either default on debt or default on services, as had been stated there. So what government is doing, we have not defaulted on any debt yet, but that has compromised some service delivery in the county and at the national level, as we'll see. A few months ago, the salaries to ministries, the employees in the ministries had been delayed. In the counties, the delay was even worse, spanning to about 3 to 4 months in some counties. So there's a compromise on service delivery, although perhaps the debt repayment or debt service has not been defaulted. We're looking at it as also as an increasing proportionate of government spending. So of the revenue that the government is collecting, 50% goes to debt service. So even future borrowing is being incurred to finance recurrent expenditure. So we are borrowing today to finance, not investment, not development. So the return on investment is also very low, and some of them is very high. The government has tried to do domestic borrowing or to grow the domestic borrowing market, which has not been very successful. And the rate is also very high at 17%. That was 2 months ago. There was an attempt to float bonds and bills that didn't pick out quite well. So we had to go to the external borrowing once again. So those are the dynamics we are playing against. So the impact on service delivery is compromised to services. So the budget at the national level, the absorption is significantly higher, but it's not at 100%. But it's much lower at the county level, seeing that 20% of the budget is not absorbed, because the budget either gets there very late or never gets there before the close of the year. So that's the compromise and the effect of debt and debt service to the service delivery. Also looking at the MDAs being very constrained by the extent of operations or investments or projects they can undertake. So new projects either stalling, or if they start, they do not have enough resources to see them to the end. So we have some small bits of projects cumulatively that have also increased the pending bills. So the private sector also is not able to benefit from this borrowing because the government is not able to pay. And the public cannot benefit from it because the project that was the investment did not bring any return. So that is the impact that we are seeing. And looking at the fiscal consolidation on social sectors, per capita spending on health is also stagnating. On education is the same. For social protection, also stagnating, as the debt service and the repayment to debt are increasing. So every other year, and the population is growing and we are retaining the same budget, the level of basic services is compromised. And it means that we are not able to allocate more efficiently to take care of the vulnerable populations. Now, there are some external debt sustainability thresholds, some of them that you have reached, others that we are within. The present value of external debt to GDP ratio, we are doing well on that one. And over time, we are trying to reduce it. If you look at debt to export ratio, the present value of debt to export ratio, the threshold is 180. We've breached that, but over the years, there's in the medium term, trying to go back to the threshold. And what is happening, the government has done some reforms, especially in domestic resource mobilization through the national tax policy and the medium-term revenue strategy. Those policy documents are supposed to expand the tax base and increase the revenue, but it's not picked up quite yet, because these are in draft forms. The government came in a year ago and still pushing towards seeing some of these reforms come into fulfillment. So this the debt service to export ratio, that one we have also defaulted, but we are good on debt service to revenue ratio. So the risk is still high. We are in a high risk of debt distress, and we are hoping that in the medium term, if the reforms in tax and revenue mobilization are effected, we should be able to move to the medium debt distress. Some of the institutional reforms accompanying fiscal consolidation include the bottom-up economic transformation agenda by the new government, which is looking at investing in high-value, high-return areas from health, housing, looking at digital superhighway, looking at investment in MSMEs, and looking at investment in education. So there are some reforms that are already going into that as part of the overall agenda of the government. Also, the public finance management reform strategy. The new strategy is should be the 2018-2023 strategy is coming to an end, and a new strategy is coming up with the attempt to increase efficiency in government operations, and also increasing and expanding the resource base for the country, and same for the national tax policy and the medium-term debt strategy. Other structural reforms, it was in the manifesto of the government, but it's not been implemented yet. Consolidation of the state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises consume about 28% of the overall budget. And most of them are either loss-making or getting funds from the exchequer. But instead of consolidating them, we've actually seen them increase. They are more SOEs than they were in the previous years. The human development through education reforms and primary focus on health through UHC and primary health financing. We're also seeing promoting transparency and accountability also as a key reform. The government empowering institutions that are able to mitigate and fight corruption and mismanagement of resources. Then other non-inflationary financing includes expanding the domestic market for borrowing so that the shocks and vulnerabilities that are externally motivated could be managed, and issuance of long-term instruments. Finally, we are looking at what the government can do to retain control on public finance. There is one strategy that worked very effectively. It's called the Economic Recovery Strategy of 2003. It was implemented and it moved Kenya from a negative growth of negative 1% to 5%. That means it was one of the most effective policies that Kenya has implemented. And it had four main pillars. One of them is macroeconomic stability. This is managing inflation. Right now, the inflation is within the levels that the government targets of 7.5%. But the last month between January to March, it was in upwards of about 10%. So as we move forward, we're looking at also private sector-led growth. There's in the medium-term revenue strategy, there's an attempt to reduce the corporate tax from 30% to 25%, in a way pushing more investment by the private sector. Then human development, as mentioned, on education, on health, on social protection, and also good governance, which is addressing issues of corruption, of mismanagement, and transparency and accountability. What remains a key question is the involvement of civil society and think tanks like IPF in advancing issues of accountability, because a civil society organization or think tank cannot on its own or by itself enforce accountability. And the role of the think tanks and institutions are not very clear on how they can enforce that accountability in the new platform. So I beg to stop there in the interest of time, and happy to respond to any questions. Thank you.
Daniel, thanks. Thanks, Daniel. That was great. I think Kenya is a very important example, because I think, as Mr. Slassi said in our first panel, that whilst we kind of have a lot of media focus on the countries that have defaulted, like Ghana and Zambia and Sri Lanka, actually a much more common challenge is the kind of challenges that Kenya is facing, where there's no default, but debt burdens are rising, squeezing out non-interest spending and affecting, you know, as you so eloquently told us, the infrastructure and social spending rather than a debt crisis. So we're now going to zoom out from a specific country case to a broader look across sub-Saharan Africa. So Luke, I'd like you to invite you to present now. You're going to be presenting us research from this new IMF paper, which I'm pleased to say is being released today, and this is the first public presentation of it. So I encourage everyone to go and look at the paper and the blog on the IMF website. It's called Navigating Fiscal Challenges in Sub-Saharan Africa, Resilient Strategies and Credible Anchors in Turbulent Waters. So Luke, tell us a bit more about what does the paper say about the current fiscal problems and what you suggest as priorities for countries' fiscal strategies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm very briefly going to present this paper that, thank you, we launched today at this conference. It's joint work from an IMF team. And the motivation of this paper is, the motivation of this paper is that the region, as Abebe mentioned this morning, is facing a very challenging fiscal environment marked by a spike in both the level of debt and the cost of debt. Frontier markets have lost market access, and even the poorest economies have really difficulties in mobilizing cheap financing. That's what we have called at the IMF the big funding squeeze. The paper shows that a new strategy is needed in order to avoid further deterioration of budgetary position and the risk of a systemic debt crisis. The paper provides advice on how to design medium-term strategies, especially how to calibrate fiscal targets. And the paper also looks at this important question of policy implementation and how to address very large implementation risks in the region. Start with this slide showing that the debt problems in Africa have recently received a lot of attention in the media, but also among donors and policymakers. After declining in the first decade of the 2000s following the international debt relief initiatives, the regional debt has increased very fast, doubling in the past decade from 30% of GDP to about 60% of GDP today. As of 2023, more than half of the low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa were assessed by the IMF as being either in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress, according to our debt sustainability analysis. A few high-profile debt restructuring cases in Chad, in Ghana or Zambia have shown that these operations have become much more complex because of the diversity of creditors and of instruments. So one of the key policy priorities for the region is to slow this trend and avoid a more widespread crisis. So one of the main themes, one of the main findings of our paper is that fiscal policy in Africa lacks what we call an effective anchor. This is not totally specific to the region, and the lack of anchoring but the lack of anchoring, I would say, is more pronounced in the African region than elsewhere. Our paper offers several, I would say, analyses to support this claim, and let me briefly present 5 pieces of evidence. The first one is, like everywhere else in the world, debt projections have drifted up. And the chart on the slide shows the revisions of our projections across vintages. And each year we tend to revise the debt trajectory upward. And these revisions have been sometimes larger than in other regions in the world. Second fact, an econometric analysis, we conducted an economic analysis to test whether countries' fiscal balances improve when debt increases, which could creating a kind of correction mechanism. And we find that while there is a positive response in fiscal balance to debt in advanced economies, we don't find any statistical significant response in sub-Saharan Africa. And third, we conduct also a third exercise, which is to measure the maximum primary balances achieved by countries in the past over a certain period of time, say 3 or 5 years. Windows. And we find that these maximum primary balances, which are a kind of measure of the peak effort that countries can achieve, these maximum primary balances were lower in Africa than in other regions. This means that it's more difficult for them to sustain elevated surpluses for long. Another example of the lack of anchoring is provided by the deviations from fiscal rules. Many African economies have fiscal rules, but in the decade before COVID pandemic, they tended to bridge these deficit ceilings more often than other countries, on average half of the time, and by a larger margin. Finally, we did a last exercise comparing fiscal forecasts and outcomes. We found large deviations. Fiscal balances tend to be 1% of GDP lower ex post than projected 3 years earlier in African economies. Thus, overall, taking all this evidence together, it's fair to say that there is a phenomenon of drift in fiscal policy in the region. And this drift is multidimensional. It's a drift observed over time compared to plans across vintages, compared to fiscal rules, or in relationship to debt levels. In our view, this drift could be mitigated by introducing more credible and implemented, actually, more credible medium-term fiscal strategies to try to re-anchor fiscal policy. And that's, in a sense, the purpose of this paper, which is to describe the main components of these fiscal strategies alongside 6 important dimensions that I'm going to discuss in the next slides. The first one is starting with the question of fiscal targets. Our conclusion is that fiscal targets in sub-Saharan Africa are often poorly calibrated and too focused on short-term deficit targets with insufficient emphasis placed on debt targets. In our view, debt targets are fundamental to anchor a fiscal strategy without a clear view of where debt should go in the medium term. Fiscal policy lacks direction and tends to be too short-term oriented. Our paper proposes a new methodology to calibrate these debt targets based on the principle of preservation of the debt servicing capacity. The level of the debt ceiling or the debt target is in our methodology calibrated to ensure that interest to revenue remain manageable. I mean, the details are in the paper. So why this emphasis in the debt calibration on the debt service and not on the debt level itself? But for two reasons. One, it's very difficult to estimate or to guess the maximum debt levels in Africa because there have been very few episodes of debt distress in the past 2 decades post, HIPC. And the second, so basically, but we have, I think, a better understanding of the limits on the debt service that we have at that level. And second reason, in many economies, the main problem is not the debt level, but it's the debt cost, as was discussed this morning. You have actually cases where debt is very high, but because it's concessional, it's not a big problem. So the key constraint is really the capacity to service debt. And using this methodology, we compute country-specific debt anchors for the region. And on average, we find an average debt anchor of 55% of GDP, with half of the countries today being above their country-specific debt anchor. Turning now to a very important policy question, which is the size of the adjustment needed. So some argue, some journalists, but also I heard this morning, some people argue that all countries in Africa are in a debt crisis and that many of them would need debt restructuring. And there have been very alarming press articles. Our findings do not support this view. When we compute the fiscal adjustment needs, which are the change in the primary balance needed to bring back a debt to a safe level, we find a very big diversity of situations. So this estimation is based on various estimates of the debt safe level because we don't exactly know what it is. So we use different approaches. In one case, we assume that debt would go back to pre-COVID levels. In another one, we use the fiscal debt rule ceilings. In a third case, we use this debt anchor that I've just mentioned before that we computed with the debt servicing capacity. And our conclusion is that in the region, adjustment needs for an average country seem feasible using traditional fiscal instrument. I mean, using fiscal adjustment, not debt restructuring. Because we find average adjustment needs of 2-3% of GDP for a medium country, which given, and we show that as well, the history of African economies seems feasible to achieve in the medium term. In fact, actually, we find that 1/4 of the countries have negative needs, meaning they have fiscal space. And as my director, Abebe Selassie, said this morning, we have, of course, a certain number of countries that are, on the contrary, in very difficult situation and where actually the fiscal adjustment needs that we compute are so large that it's not possible through fiscal consolidation alone to achieve them. And for this, debt restructuring is important. But they don't represent the majority of the countries in the region. Turning now to the third question, which is the one on composition. These 2-3% of GDP that we mentioned, should they be achieved by raising revenue or cutting expenditure? So we built a data set of past consolidation episodes in the region and found that in the majority of cases, countries in Africa have tended to consolidate on the expenditure side, mainly by cutting capital expenditure, and which is obviously not optimal from a development perspective. And our recommendation is actually to shift the emphasis and place much more emphasis on domestic revenue mobilization for several reasons. One, it has a very large potential, as discussed this morning. Two, it's less damaging for growth than cutting capex, and there is evidence for that based on fiscal multipliers. And three, more revenue means also more capacity to repay debt and hence an increased borrowing capacity. So you have a leverage effect through higher domestic revenue mobilization. The downside of revenue-based consolidation cannot totally be overlooked. And this morning, some were discussed, including political hurdles and also impact on inequality. But we think that some design choices can, to a large extent, mitigate these problems. Fourth, another question is the pace of adjustment, whether the adjustment should be gradual, front-loaded in the initial years or back-loaded. For advanced economies, our recommendation is generally for the adjustment to be very gradual and be larger in the years when the growth cost is minimal, especially when the output gap is positive. But the multipliers tend to be low in sub-Saharan Africa, regardless of the cycle. And so this is not a very strong argument to postpone the fiscal adjustment. Other reasons for front-loading the adjustment include large financing constraint in sub-Saharan Africa, hence front-loading is sometimes the only option, and credibility effects. On the institution side, implementation risks, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, are very high in sub-Saharan Africa. We saw multiple evidence of de-anchoring, fiscal slippages, and difficulties to stick to plans. Strong institutions are fundamental to reduce these implementation challenges. In fact, we could say easily, and I think everybody would agree here, that institutional reform is a prerequisite for policy reform. This is true everywhere in the world, but I think it's even more true in Africa, where institutional capacity is lower. Our paper discusses how reforms should be tailored to the Africa context in four main areas: medium-term budgeting, fiscal risk management, expenditure controls, and revenue administration. And the slides here just give you a flavor of what we discuss in the paper, which is specific recommendations that are tailored to a low-income context in these four areas. So developing macro fiscal ability, developing a central risk management capacity, automating some budget procedures, rolling out digitalization in tax collection. So how all these priorities should be adapted in the case of low-income countries. And that's it on my side. I have a last slide on the support, but we can leave it for the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Luc. That was great. So I just want to pick up this point about kind of having credible debt anchors, and you said the median is around 55% of GDP, and obviously that's not Kenya's specific one, but Daniel, I wonder if I can just ask you to reflect on, I think Kenya's debt GDP ratio is now up to around 70%. As a member of the East African community, it signed up to agree fiscal rules among the community to have a debt target around 50% of GDP. Why do you think these kind of debt targets that Kenya has signed up to have not been credible and have not been adhered to?
Right. Thank you. The debt ceiling, also it's good to mention, it's moved from 50% to an absolute figure, to a higher absolute figure, to 70%, and now to 50%. I think just trying to play around with the denominator, if that doesn't work, you push the ceiling now to an absolute figure. And mainly because the expenditure is really high and increasing, and there is no simpler way to balance between the revenue that the government is able to collect and the expenditure pressures that are there. In the last 10 years, the government pursued the expansionary fiscal policies, but the return on investment on the debt incurred did not respond to the domestic resource mobilization. So the gap grew bigger and bigger. And so the attempts to reduce that have been like very reactionary and trying to see what can work. There are also expenditures that are politically motivated. They famously call them roadside declarations, where a politician promises a road, a bridge or something, and it has to be factored in a supplementary budget. So ultimately, the expenditure grows bigger at the end of the year than what had been approved. So there's also that failure by Parliament to manage the amount of borrowing that is incurred by the executive within the budget. So that the convergence criteria, the 50% convergence criteria, is difficult to achieve with a kind of fiscal framework that doesn't adhere to public financial management principles. So every other time that alteration happens, it expands the expenditure, but nothing is done on the revenue. If there are reforms on revenue, they are also long-term, they're not short-term, cannot adjust the most immediate needs. And the most likely thing the government does is to tap into the already formal sector that has been, also overly taxed because there are no efforts the efforts to tap in the informal sector are not working very effectively. And that still continues.
Great, Thank you very much. And I think some of your points there talk to the issue Rattan raised in the opening about looking at what the funds being borrowed, what are they being invested in, and are governments able to get a kind of tax return off the economic expansion that should produce if they're well designed. But I'm now going to turn to Delphine. So Delphine, I know the OECD undertakes regular surveys of its members on budgetary practices. So can you tell us a bit more about what you're learning from this, about some of the challenges that OECD countries are facing in managing spending control?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for the invitation to the OECD. As you know, we are an institution with 38 member countries, which are mostly advanced economies. But we also have regional networks in Asia, in the Middle East, in North Africa. It's very important for us to be part of this global dialogue and share the experience of OECD countries. So for OECD countries, let me say a few introductive words that will echo what we heard during the first session. You know that OECD countries emerge from successive crises with higher budget deficits and debts, and consequently they are confronted to significant rises in short-term spending from the higher burden of servicing public debt. What we are observing at the moment, this was explained in the economic outlook that was published a few days ago, is that there is a modest fiscal consolidation that is taking place at the moment, mainly reflecting savings from the full withdrawal of the pandemic support and the gradual phasing out of energy-related support. However, more consolidation efforts are needed, and in contrast with emerging and developing economies, they will probably have to focus on the expenditure side, because on average the capacity to raise revenue will be of course more limited. At the same time, the OECD countries are facing significant longer-term fiscal challenges from the impact of climate change, aging populations, we heard about that this morning, government spending on pensions, health and long-term care is estimated by the OECD to rise by around 5% of GDP by 2060 if policy remains the same. So in OECD countries, the situation could be summed up as one where short-term fiscal pressures, fiscal challenges may appear less acute than in other countries, but longer-term challenges are critical, and ministries of finance need to learn how to budget in the short-term to long-term fiscal squeeze, so to say. Against this background, the questions are what budget systems, PFM systems, will need to deliver in the coming years, and whether they are fit for purpose in their current state. So on what budget systems we need to deliver, let me start with a few words about the future of public spending conferences that have been organized by the OECD since last year, to seek perspectives from leading academics and thought leaders on public finance. And one thing that many of the speakers highlighted was an increasing concern with the fact that mounting and unfunded spending needs were still to be recognized by both politicians and the general public, and that without such recognition, it was doubtful that PFM systems in the OECD would evolve in a way that would be suited to the future challenges. So there is big fiscal communication issue. On what budget systems will need to deliver, I think there is widespread recognition in the budget officials community of OECD countries that there are three critical areas that we already heard about. First, we need credible fiscal frameworks with strong political ownership. This is really important. That will provide a clear indication to citizens and markets about the medium-term trajectory of public finances and what will be done to ensure a gradual reduction of debt to GDP ratios. Second, we need budget processes that should allow revisiting routinely and effectively existing expenditures and identify opportunities for reallocations. And the key point is that these reviews and reallocations will likely be needed on a very large scale in the OECD, and this is because spending priorities, as reflected in current budgets of OECD countries, are to a large extent a legacy of a time when society and economies of advanced economies were quite different from what they are today. And third, we need more sophisticated approaches to new spending decisions. And this includes using the possibilities offered by the new technologies, AI, big data, and we see that already happening in OECD countries significantly, and this will be needed for targeting better government spending. But it also requires developing better capacities at identifying systematically the impacts and the added value of new spending proposals in key policy areas such as the environment, climate, gender mainstreaming, and other key priorities of OECD countries' governments. Now, on whether budget systems in the OECD are fit for this purpose, as you know, there have been quite a lot of budget reforms that took place after the global financial crisis. And in OECD countries, it was basically a small number of budget reforms pioneered by some very advanced countries that had been more generally adopted by OECD countries. And in particular, many countries have sought to introduce top-down and medium-term budgeting, which were expected to bring better allocation of resources, spending prioritization, and also fiscal discipline. So as you can see on the left, medium-term expenditure frameworks, MTFs, which are typically the outcome of top-down and medium-term budgeting processes, were used by just a half of OECD countries before the GFC, but by almost all of them before the pandemic. However, these reforms do not yet always deliver the expected outcomes. And in our most recent survey of budget practices in the OECD, we asked our senior budget officials network whether the most recent budget they had prepared was consistent with the ceilings that had been set in the previous year MTF. And what the survey's preliminary results show is that only a quarter of OECD countries had actually complied with these ceilings. And there is a huge heterogeneity of circumstances in the countries, but the reasons why there have been these divergences comes down to two broad reasons. First one, structural issues with the MTF design and processes. And the second one is conjunctural issues caused by the poly crisis, as phrased by the ODI. So the structural issues include the fact that ceilings are sometimes revised annually at the outset of the budget formulation process, which is undermining the process and the credibility of preparing a MTF. Ceilings are sometimes breached because there is a lack of robust multi-year baseline expenditure forecast. There are many other reasons, but capacities is one of them. The conjunctural issues are basically the fact that greater flexibility or even discretion has been granted to governments during the pandemic in managing public spending. They could operate without a fixed budget calendar. They could design new policy measures without clear estimates of their impact on the level of public debt. They could even use off-budget funds sometimes. And at a time when politicians continue to grapple with an ongoing sequence of crises, there is maybe, as could be expected, a reluctance to go back to the pre-pandemic ways of budgeting. So to conclude this presentation, I think the key question for the session was what have we learned from the previous crisis, from this crisis? I think what we see at this moment is that we are not in the same time than the GFC when a lot of countries were thinking of completely changing their budget frameworks and did launch a number of very important reforms. On the contrary, there is a desire to strengthen the existing PFM frameworks. And I think getting back to a point that was made earlier, we have a fairly good toolbox. It's just about learning how to use these tools a little bit better. So at the OECD, to support this effort, we have worked on a spending better framework that is defining key entities, function, processes, and procedures that together are necessary for quality budget institutions. What we see at the moment, this was another question from the ODI colleagues, well, where is the focus at the moment in OECD countries? What we see is that there is a lot of effort that is put into improving the spending reviews frameworks. Lots of OECD countries already have spending reviews processes, but they want to improve them to make them more effective. There is also, I think, a willingness to revisit the basics of the fiscal frameworks in many OECD countries, because their limits are being acknowledged and also the impacts, the damages that the pandemic has caused. So several countries in particular are in the process of revising their fiscal rules. And we will see how the fiscal anchors are going to evolve in the future. And finally, to conclude, I want to say that despite the fact that there is this focus on spending reviews and probably budget directors and ministries of finance foresee the fiscal consolidation effort, we do not see any decreased effort in moving forward green budgeting or gender budgeting. These type of reforms remain at the forefront of the concerns of the ministries of finance, because they know that in the future, it's not going to be only about reallocating, but about spending better and reallocating money where it matters more. And this is very much showing from what we see of what is being done at the moment in the ministries. So thank you.
Delphine, thank you very much. I just want to pick up one of the things that you highlighted, which is that the challenges in kind of implementing medium-term budgeting frameworks in OECD countries. And so, Luc, I just wonder if, given that having a stronger medium-term budget framework was one of the things you highlighted as necessary in your presentation, whether that provokes any thoughts in you about the kind of applicability or realism of highlighting these as a key component of fiscal strategies for African countries.
Well, that's actually a good example of a reform that needs to be adapted to the African context. And I would not say necessarily that they need a medium-term budget framework. I would say they need a medium-term framework, and how it's done, whether it's a medium-term fiscal framework, budget framework, whether it's indicative binding, I mean, the range of options. I think what we see in Africa is that many countries have actually medium-term fiscal frameworks, but they are not really useful. And they are not very useful for several reasons. One is that the annual budget itself is not credible. So given that the annual budget is not credible, it's difficult to build on that a credible medium-term framework. And one of the reasons why it's not credible is also because I think one of the key precondition is not present, which is sometimes that the macro fiscal capacity is relatively limited to do a projection in revenue, in expenditure, in deficits and debt. And also another issue that exists in the region is the one that I mentioned, which is that the high-level fiscal objectives, which could be enshrined in rules or not, are sometimes either not present or not credible. So I would say if there is a priority, it would be first to establish this anchor first at the high level, so that the medium-term budget fiscal framework can really fit into or be consistent with these high-level fiscal objectives, and improve really the accuracy and the capacity in macro fiscal forecasting. So that's perhaps how I would describe the priorities for low-income countries. And then later, you go from this to a more developed medium-term fiscal framework, and when the capacity is there, move gradually towards medium-term budget frameworks, initially indicative, of course.
Great, thank you, thank you. I'm going to hand over to Kay now. Kay, you're head of CABRI. You're a former head of budget planning in South African Treasury. So can I ask you to use your extensive experience to give us more of an insider pictures of how negotiations over spending control play out?
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. I have not been invited here only to speak about South Africa, because CABRI is for the whole of Africa, so I'm going to refer a bit to South Africa, but then also to our experiences on the continent. So CABRI back in 2017 had already noticed or taken note of the fact that there are circumstances which can bring an acute budget pressure to bear, like the Ebola experience within Liberia, or a sudden change in oil prices, military activities, and so on. So already there was a conference in Ouagadougou in 2017 to look at this and see what countries can do. Broadly speaking, there were 4 things that came out of this conference. Firstly, the role of the Ministry of Finance in buffering political pressure. So in other words, providing the correct information around the trade-offs and options. The importance then linked to that of data in decision-making and having accurate data to be able to cost various options. Also identifying the sources of fiscal risk, and then obviously efforts to reduce the vulnerability to risk, which obviously is reduced when you have these acute pressures, which we now see manifest in the poly crisis, and the reduced ability to transfer some of those risks. Interestingly, within that conference, there was also mention made of the various budget reforms and PFM tools and so on that were used, but also mention made of maneuvering budget games, where ministries of finance were using tactics in order to balance their books. I don't know if Florence is here, but she was talking about a focus on balancing the books, but that was noted. I'm going to then jump to South Africa just as a quick example, because it was or is a poster child of PFM reform. Quickly, what can we say in South Africa's favor? Well-developed budgeting systems, we can debate this, but sort of well-recognized in worldwide PFAS, Open Budget Index, etc. Tax rates are reasonably high, so unlike perhaps what was discussed by some of the colleagues, maybe not room to increase taxes. Well-developed financial markets, not extensive use of concessionary loans and aid flows, which makes it a little different from some other countries. In terms of economic growth, definitely currently a problem with economic growth, especially caused by the stranglehold of electricity supply, high unemployment rates, high inequality, and no legislated fiscal rules, however, historically known to stick to its budget statements in terms of what it wished to achieve. What are currently the problems that we're seeing manifest? Bond issues are not fully taken up. The February main budgets did not make any provision for public sector wage increase. There's under collection on the revenue. There's more spending cuts. Spending cuts started in 2009 as belt tightening, so-called. And currently, they're busy with their in-year adjustments process, which provides only for legal changes within spending. And it's unclear that there will be funding for that. Why? Just to give you a few headlines, we choose to show you that the Minister of Finance of South Africa had received most recently, a few months back, the African Banker Finance Minister of the Year for banking reforms. Then moving forward a few months, we see that South African Minister of Finance indicates that there needs to be consolidation. The Minister of Social Development arguing for her continuation of a grant which was brought about by the COVID pandemic, which was a support grant but which has not been discontinued. In some cases viewed then to be a basic income grant type of expenditure, which there is a public outcry for anyway. So not to say that she's just having a frivolous request there. We see all kinds of information then in the media indicating that if you're going to have this particular grant, then these are the areas that need to be cut and by how much they need to be cut. So it's quite a big fiscal pressure amongst others. Also, Treasury is starting to need to raise more short-term borrowing, and the president not necessarily indicating that there need to be cuts on the spending side. So that just gives a sense, I think, of you know, a poster child, but there's a lot of trouble, and I think this is just true of the poly crisis. What I wanted to talk about was budget games. So we have the formal budget reforms in our tools in our toolbox, but there is a puzzle that we're trying to solve. I noted Delphine's puzzle was very nice and it all interlocked perfectly. But I'm talking about, I want to talk about a little bit about some of the tactics that are played and what effect they can have on the budget process. So here, and this I think all will resonate with all budget practitioners, no matter where you perhaps come from, a game within the ministry where the fiscal policy department, for example, underestimates the revenue collection or overinflates some important spending elements, so that what is made available for spending is either less, either as an increment or as a cut, a bigger cut than it needs to be. Then the budget officials go out, speak to line ministries, negotiate, etc. Towards the end of the budget process, this gets eased. The winners and losers are different and are not the same as where the reductions or the hard negotiations took place. In a way, perhaps this is like Uno, when you play a power card, you can reverse the order of play or make someone skip a turn. The truth, though, is with games, if they're repeatable games like the budget process, then there are winners and losers, and they reposition for the next round of budget negotiations. Game number 2, I think, will also be something that will resonate with people. It can happen in a cabinet committee where you have the whole budget process and you discuss the fiscal envelope, the tax, etc., and then either your Minister of Public Enterprises or Trade and Industry or whatever argues that the funding that is needed for some or other state-owned enterprise has nothing to do with this budget process. It is an investment and there's a return on investment, and so you can actually borrow for that. And I think Mark had referred to that earlier this morning, and that's perhaps where we have drafts that becomes Turkish drafts. So you have the same economy, the same participants, but you're allowed to move the pieces differently. Then the third game that I've chosen, I've only got 3, to look at is spending cuts. And this game or interaction takes place between line ministries and the Treasury. And essentially, you have a need for spending cuts, and then you have certain reforms. For example, they may relate to program-based budgeting or results-based budgeting in whichever format. You link your budget items to that, and any spending that doesn't link quite directly to that is up on the chopping block. Or you look at big bullet payments, for example, in capital, look for rescheduling, look for frill spending and spending on bottled water, where you apparently could get billions, and look for cost recovery and so on. But the point is that over time, if you look at countries, you will see, you know, a slew of reforms that were layered on and added that are formal. And I think conceptually, sometimes where the formal reforms start and stop and the tactics start can be debatable. However, there definitely are some tactics. Sometimes you end up executing a tactic in a country. Perhaps you planned it, perhaps you didn't plan it to that extent. But an example of a tactic would be you tell line departments, if you reprioritize funding, you may keep the funding. You may allow that in the first year, you may not allow it later on. It might be circumstantial. You might have predicted that up front. Either which way, there are winners and losers, and you lose trust within the budget process. I think Florence is not here, but I'm quoting her liberally while she isn't. She had spoken about changing your basis of costing, so moving from activity-based costing or to zero-based budgeting or and so on. And the idea there would be to try and get a different view on spending, and more specifically to look at cuts. And then there are other tactics of trying to make other provisions, for example, allocating funds for appropriation, but not allocating them to a line ministry. So avoiding having to actually make the decision and hoping that you actually don't, but if you do, you already have it enacted, for example. So those can be budget games and tactics, and essentially they kind of result in a bit of an implosion of the budget system. What do we have? We end up with nomic, which is actually an approach to games more than you can play it on any board, but it is essentially that you can play by any rules that you choose, and I think everyone can see what happens there. Essentially, you don't have willing participants, you have withholding of information, you have a lot of time spent in the gaming, and a lot less focus perhaps on solving the problems. I think in terms of the poly crisis, we would need to look at, and I'm not sure that this is a well-researched area, but at whether or not the gaming has increased, or whether the number of games have increased. But I think the important thing that one would want to look at is whether or not the PFM system then remains neutral, or whether the gaming within the system actually starts detracting from your efficiency of your PFM system. Essentially, at the end of the day, what you want is you want collaboration and co-creation, maybe put those puzzle pieces back together. That means there are a few tough conversations and policy choices that need to be made. That also means that we need to explore more in terms of the diagram, perhaps that we have of how our PFM systems work, from outcomes, higher order outcomes, all the way through to the mechanics. But we then also need to go and look at how that is done and how that can be better done to link to political systems and to bring others into the conversation as well, so that we really truly do have better budget outcomes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kay. That was great. And a reminder that when we're talking about all these technical reforms, that they've got to be robust to the actual human behavior that underlies the systems. And much of the success of a budgetary system is going to lie in those relationships between the different actors. And I think you illustrated that brilliantly. And I mean, just to talk about the kind of destabilization of budget games under fiscal pressures, this is something that happened in the UK, where the Treasury used to allow ministries to carry over any unspent funds and build up a surplus. And then, of course, when the global financial crisis hit and there needed to be fiscal restraint, that got abolished. And so, the incentives were not stable for how line ministers were expected to interact with the Treasury. I'm going to open up to the audience questions, to our online audience as well. Please submit your questions online and we'll be able to read them out for you as well. So please, any questions? I noticed we didn't have a woman ask a question at all in the first session. So if there is a woman who would like to answer a question, I will give you priority so that we don't have too much gender bias. I can't see one, so I'm going to take these first three over here. We'll start on the left-hand side and come over to the middle here. And again, as in the first session, if you could just introduce yourself before you ask your question as well.
Hi, my name is Mark Boland. I'm a credit research analyst for Red Intelligence here in London. I focused a lot on Africa, so I have two very quick questions. One to Daniel. So when it comes to Kenya, a lot, well, at least the part of the fiscal trouble we're in is, the political devolution, which has been, you could say a success politically has increased public services, but it's essentially added 3% of recurrent expenditure without which so far has been debt financed. And I just wanted to ask you, could you say ways to kind of increase the incentives for country governments or country governors to increase their own revenue base and make, essentially make a stronger contribution to the fiscal consolidation from the country governments? And the second quick one is to look, Luc, I know this is kind of on the fiscal side. So my question is on the financing. If you look at the countries that are in potential debt distress, for many of them, like 3/4 of the interest cost is domestic debt, which is higher. I mean, is there a way to kind of decrease? I mean, I would kind of argue that maybe they've had access to too much financing at too high rates, and for a bank, there's very little incentive to lend at the private sector at 20% when you can lend to the government at 18%. So is there anything you can see to kind of, what contribution could you have from an increased financial intermediation?
Thank you.
Thanks. Good morning. My name is Paulo De Renzio. I'm a professor at Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Rio, in Brazil. My question is also for Luc and Daniel to some extent. Starting with Luc, it's really whether in the work that you did preparing for this report, you actually considered not just what to do about sort of the current situation and consequences of past bad decisions. You could call them bad fiscal policy decisions that led to the debt built up across a number of countries, but actually looking at some of the causes of those bad decisions. I mean, you mentioned institutional reform as one of the things that is necessary for some of the solutions to sort of to take root, but unless you look at some of the underlying causes that have led to these bad decisions, then you're not very likely to see those institutional reforms happening in the first place. In some work that I'm involved in currently, we start with the proposition that there's basically a big gap in domestic accountability around decision-making around public debt. And that what you need to do in the end is to sort of really strengthen the accountability framework around public debt decision-making in a number of countries. And we're sort of exploring different ways in which you might be able to do that by working with accountability actors like parliaments, like Supreme Audit institutions, like civil society and the media and so on, to sort of prevent future debt crises rather than arguing about what needs to be done to sort of cure them after they have happened. So I was wondering whether you have any thoughts on that based on the study that you did, but also whether this is something that, Kenya is one of the, where there's an interesting example, for example, of a civil society campaign trying to promote domestic accountability around that. So that's also why I think this is relevant for Daniel. Thanks.
Marco, Andrew, we'll take both of you, and then we'll come to some answers.
Yes. Yeah. So as Marco Cangiano, ODI, Luc, again, it's for you, but clearly like to hear from Kay and Daniel as well. It's related to what Paolo said. There's a very interesting chart you showed with the debt ratio were going down, and then countries sort of graduated, so to speak, from the HIPIC. Part of that assessment, I was still at the fund at the time, was an assessment of whether countries had sufficiently strong institutions. And that was pretty based, that's all we had, PIFA score, World Bank, CPIA, etc. It was a strong bias of best practices. So I like very much the last slide you put on, and your implicit recommendation is perhaps we need to take a fresh look at this, be more pragmatic, much less best practices perhaps oriented. But the quick question to you is, did you get that wrong kind of some 10 years ago? Because at that point already we let countries go, and that just by coincidence perhaps led to the start of the funding squeeze. And we knew the interest rates even at that time could only go up, certainly not down. So again, with the usual annoying benefit of hindsight, perhaps that decision was taken a bit in haste.
Thank you. I'm Andrew Lawson from Fiscus. Two questions on issues which I think haven't been discussed very much. One relates to a comment which William Ruto made quite recently about the credit rating agencies and about the fact that credit ratings for Africa seem to be somewhat biased. I'm half Argentine, so I would say Argentina is one of the world leaders in debt defaults. But one of the interesting things is that within 3 to 4 years, its credit ratings go back up again. Whereas countries such as Kenya, that has never had a default, never get credit ratings as good as Argentina sometimes gets them. So there's clearly something not quite right. There's a bias. And the question is whether there's any role for international institutions in trying to change that bias. So that's one question. The other relates to fiscal rules and the potential role of fiscal rules and fiscal councils. Daniel referred to the convergence criteria of the East African community, but I notice Delphine and Luc, you didn't say very much about these. So I'm just wondering if you see a role for those in terms of OECD experience or broader international experience. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Andrew. So we've got quite a range of questions. The incentives for subnational governments in Kenya to raise revenues, the domestic debt markets. Andrew raises a related question for external debt of credit rating agencies. Daniel, I think you've got a few questions addressed to you. Do you want to go first? And then I'll go to Luke, and then Delphine and Kay, you can come in with any comments you would like to add.
All right, thank you for those questions. I take some of them, and I think Luke will support me in some of the ones that refers to IMF especially. So whether there is an incentive for counties or subnational governments to increase domestic resource mobilization, there's a robust formula that the national government uses to distribute revenue to subnational government. And one of the parameters they use is fiscal prudence. Although it's a very small proportion, it was initially factored in the first two formulas. We are now doing a third formula. It was removed since the revision of that formula. So the incentive to really mobilize resources is not really there, and there's over-reliance from national government transfers. But also noting that one of the there are three main streams of revenue that some national governments can collect. One of them is property taxes. Property taxes are huge of them that has a huge potential, but the responsibility of updating valuation rolls that values the property to the current value belongs to the national government. So if the national government doesn't update the valuation roll, the property taxes that the counties can collect is limited by the extent of valuation that the national government does. So there's that gap there. But the studies have shown that there's a huge potential for counties to collect, especially on property taxes. But more incentive would be there if there was a fiscal prudence parameter reinstated to ensure that the counties that are able to collect more benefit also from the national level share. But more importantly is the functions that are primarily subnational functions should also be accompanied by resources from the national government. It's not the case currently. There are still functions that are primarily funded by the county government, but the money for those functions remains with the national government. So even if you're able to support devolution, the money should also support functions. On the question of debt accountability framework and some of the coalitions that we are supporting in Kenya is the Okoa Uchumi that supports transparency in debt procurement and debt processes, which essentially is one of the biggest gaps, because if you're not aware of the terms of debt and how much you're supposed to give as collateral, then anything goes. So sometimes the interest is very high, the negotiations are poor or very hasty because there is an urgent demand for borrowing, and there is essentially no return. And some of those documents are not publicly available. So even following through to see what was the market providing Did you take the most efficient and effective, loan terms? Is Parliament involved in these processes? Because also sometimes when you hear some of these commentaries, even by members of Parliament saying they are not aware what are what the terms of that debt procurement were. So that framework can be pushed forward. Then on credit rating, I think I agree with the president on that one, but I will invite Luke to comment more on that, because we are crying that loudly, and I support him on this. What can African governments do to ensure that this credit rating is done, and also that is also able to be adjusted considering the circumstances that the governments also have to endure?
Thanks, Daniel. Luke, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for this very interesting question. So perhaps I'll start with the one on the debt drivers. I mean, we have done debt decompositions to see basically what were the main drivers of debt over the last decade, basically, and why did the debt went from 30% of GDP to 60% of GDP. And when we do this decomposition at the country level or at the aggregate level, what we find is quite interesting, which is that, of course, the cumulative fiscal deficits are a big driver of debt. We could expect that. But a very large also driver of debt are the stock flow adjustment, which is this unknown gap between the cumulative primary deficit, the impact on interest growth and exchange rate, and the change in debt. And actually what we have found is in Sub-Saharan Africa, every year, the stock flow adjustment account on average for 1.5% of GDP, which is really significant. If you accumulate that over 10 years, you see that, I mean, it's not exactly additive, but it's almost half of the debt increases due to that. And indeed, these stock flow adjustments are mostly related to poor PFM practices, and perhaps the institutional capacity was not there when this, so I don't know how to interpret that, but at least there is weakness in PFM that is really a very big, I think, explanation in this story. On the fiscal deficit side, when you do further decomposition, you see that there are two main elements here. One is the shocks, the external shocks that are very important to explain the increase in deficit, especially the commodity price shocks in Africa, because you see big increase in deficits in countries that are resource rich when the revenues collapse, especially after 2015. Exchange rate also can be a very big shock that affects that. And the second big explanation we discussed this morning is increase in public investment, and the problem that the returns of this investment were not really taxed. So basically, you see the increase in the spending, but you don't have the increase in revenues even a few years later. So as a result, that never decreases. On your question about the cost of debt and the cost of domestic debt, so I think it's really a very big issue now in the region. More than half of the debt in Sub-Saharan Africa is domestic, 60% actually, which is something that people don't necessarily know. They have the impression that all the debt is external or even coming from donors. This is absolutely not true. Most of the debt now is domestic. And the cost of this domestic debt is indeed quite higher. I mean, I think before the crisis was above 200 basis points higher compared to a Euro bond, for instance. So I think the fundamental question today, except if, of course, we can mobilize more concessional finance, which will be the way we are trying to push at the fund to of course, reduce the cost of debt, is to reduce these domestic borrowing costs. And here, I think one of the solutions, which is very complex to implement, is financial market developments. And the problem is that this cost is very elevated because also markets in many African economies are very small. So how do you do that? It's a long-term process, you know, financial market development, which can take sometimes a decade or 2 decades. So it's not really a magic solution to the problem of the cost of domestic debt, but I think it's probably the solution in the medium term. Regarding your question about, so the question on fiscal council, I'll take first. I mean, we believe at the fund that they're very useful. The problem in a low-income country context is that human capacity is limited. So it's not like you have so many people in many ministries of finance that are so good that you could put some at the Ministry of Finance, some also in a fiscal council, some at the central bank. So the question is, again, how do we adapt this model of fiscal councils to a low-income context? And here, some of the ideas that we had is perhaps at some point For instance, when we discussed it at the WAEMU level in West Africa, you could not have one fiscal council per country, but perhaps one for the 8 countries of the WAEMU. Another idea was perhaps to put perhaps the fiscal council in institutions that already exist, for instance, the central bank, the statistical institute, or the audit institution. I think we need to be creative here and perhaps find models that are not exactly a replication of what you observe in advanced economies. And finally, regarding your question on credit rating, so I mean, we have not done analysis on that, so I'm not going to give you an answer because I don't know it. What I know is that we have looked at the question of whether there is a systematic bias in the risk premium in the debt cost, which is a kind of related questions. And statistically, we could not find that. So I'm sorry to be a bit disappointed here. The countries that pay higher debt costs in Africa tend to be the ones that have the highest debt and the most deteriorated fundamentals. And you don't really see a systematic bias against African countries when we look at that. So that's, but we have not done the analysis for credit ratings. So perhaps the finding would be different from credit ratings, but at least this question comes all the time, whether there is a bias in the cost. It's not very visible in the data. The higher cost in Africa comes from the fact that the debt situation has really deteriorated very much, and this is reflected in debt costs. That's it.
Thanks, Luc. Delphine?
Yes, on fiscal rules and fiscal councils, maybe some very quick remarks. So virtually all OECD countries have fiscal rules, very few exceptions. And the number of fiscal councils is very much increasing. At the OECD, we have quite a lot of analytical work, best practices. We are supporting a lot fiscal councils, and we do believe they have an absolutely crucial role to play. Of course, fiscal councils are not going to be the solution to a lack of decision-making on fiscal issues in ministries of finance. So it's important to have strong fiscal councils with appropriate responsibilities, but at the same time, the reforms of the fiscal frameworks are needed. And on fiscal rules, I think there is, as you know, a lot of discussions on what are the most appropriate fiscal rules for the future, which is a whole separate and long discussion we could have. But the focus at the moment is maybe more on reinstating these medium-term expenditure frameworks that are allowing countries to explain how they intend to meet the fiscal targets. So I wouldn't say the problem is a lack of fiscal targets. The problem might be more that it's a moment when there is this lack of clarity on whether the fiscal, on how the fiscal targets will be met, irrespective of whether these fiscal targets are smart or not, which is another problem.
I'm going to come in on Marco's question, but I'm going to reframe it slightly so that it's not just about debt per se. So about best practice, just to say that I think in terms of our thinking around PFM systems, we do need to really think around sort of technically where the job of the Ministry of Finance starts and stops and relates to line ministries and so on. We also then need to look at the social contract and see the other players that need to be involved. How usefully can a Ministry of Finance engage civil society, engage politicians, etc.? We understand that the budget is very technical and aspects of it is really technical, but at the end of the day, it is the people's money, and we have to find a way to explain this and explain trade-offs to others so that we have a clearer idea of the effectiveness of our PFM system. And if the PFM system fails, or there's too much copy-paste of best practices, it should then be easier for us to identify where the problem might be. Of course, nothing ever will beat unpacking that problem then specifically and finding a specific solution to that problem.
Great, thank you. As we started a bit late, I'm going to keep you away from your lunch a little bit longer and take a second round of questions. So we've got one over here. Rebecca, is that a hand there? Tim, and over there. So if we start on this side again.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Antonia. I'm from the Zurich University in Switzerland. And I have a question to Luc and Delphine. So I was wondering, and I say this in the spirit of yesterday's discussion on rethinking PFM. So when I heard your presentation, Luc, you said basically the debt or the fiscal rules or the debt breaks are ignored. And I was wondering, and then your answer to that was recalibrating the rules. And so I was wondering, is this really the right answer? You know, has it, and also this question goes to Delphine, have you thought about that maybe fiscal rules or debt breaks work only in certain, you know, under certain circumstances? And because my understanding is that you always need to sort of build in an exit clause. So if this, you know, so I'm not sure if I'm making myself understood, but I come from a country context, you know, Switzerland, and in Switzerland, it's really, it's almost a fetish that the dislike of public debt. So the citizens demand fiscal discipline, and therefore, you know, it's easily enforced, you know. So I was just wondering, have you ever thought about, or have you ever questioned whether that might be the right instrument? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Simpson. I'm an economic historian at Oxford and a former ODIer. But I just had a question. This was sort of sparked by Luc's comment that one of the first things to what typically gets cut in a budget squeeze first is the capital budget. And if we look historically, that's very clear trend in the data, right? The capital expenditure tends to be the first thing on the cutting block. So I'm just wondering if that's something you're already starting to see and how you're thinking about that, particularly in the context of a dialogue around climate finance that's very focused on an assumption that there needs to be large continued investment financing flowing to Africa. And so how do those two kind of the short term and that longer term vision come together? And do you see other types of financing responses, maybe not through the government, that will still ensure that climate finance doesn't fall off the agenda?
There was a question from over here as well, and then we'll come back to you, Tim. Okay, sorry, it's the same mic.
Thank you. I'm Martin Kessler from the Finance for Development Lab, a think tank based in Paris. I have a question for Luc and Daniel. You know, my understanding of the message of the report is that there are high debt pressures, but kind of manageable adjustment, but which need to be done in the medium term. A lot of liquidity support from the international system. So my question is the international system, the World Bank, the IMF, the African Development Bank, right-sized for this support towards the medium term? And putting in the context of Kenya, especially for 2034, there's this bond that will take a large share of revenues. So is, you know, international support, how do you, which form should it take? Especially how do you view the President Ruto's proposal to reschedule over long term the debt service that is owed?
Sorry, there's one last question back here.
Hi, I'm Tim Williamson from the World Bank. I was reminded of a conference in this room about 15 years ago when there was a discussion on budget as theatre, and I think that was around the Malawi case. And I'm struck by this conversation again being sort of quite technical and talking about technical solutions to some of these problems when hinting at it, this is a people problem. I'm also recall a conversation I had on fiscal rules with I think the head of the macro department in the Ministry of Finance in Tanzania, a guy, Mr. Kamugisha, I think his name was, and he was discussing whether they were worth it. And his argument was, not really. We have fiscal discipline and macro fiscal discipline at the moment, not because of fiscal rules, but because there's a political consensus that we need to enforce it. And I think and so how does one create such a consensus that this is needed when, let's say, in OECD countries, perhaps the cat has been let out of the bag with some sort of with greater flexibility. And I was thinking about, we heard about games in the budget process, but Daniel, my previous job in the World Bank was in Kenya, and I used to tease the macro people when we were talking about revenue projections. I used to say, in 5 minutes, I can come up with a more credible revenue number than you have, and it's not about technical nature or necessarily of projections. It's about realism. And similarly, in Kenya, one of the sort of a set of games that takes place every week and every month is around cash management and the allocation of cash during budget execution. And I would argue, in terms of the accumulation of domestic debt in Kenya and other countries, a lot of it comes down to the way day-to-day cash is actually managed and how that impacts on the domestic debt. And that is a lot of the driver of why domestic debt in Kenya is debt service in Kenya is 50% of revenue.
Thank you. So Tim, you started off saying that I think this is maybe a theme that comes across, which is how far do these technical reforms will only have an impact insofar as they actually change behaviour of the actors in the budget process. And I think that's a point which I can perhaps ask everyone to reflect on. But you then bring it back to one of the most kind of technical areas of PFM reform and talking about cash management. And What I suggest we do is I'm going to ask people our panelists to answer that, and also to offer up any closing reflections they have as well. I think we've got a similar set of questions from Rebecca and from Martin on thinking about, are we seeing capital expenditure cuts already, and is there kind of is there international assistance that set up to support the kind of what Luke you highlighted as manageable adjustments, right? I think that Daniel, there was a specific question for you on the big kind of principal repayment that Kenya is going to be facing next year on its Eurobonds, and some questions about fiscal rules and whether they work and whether they really matter, or it's the underlying political consensus that is really the issue at stake. So what I'm going to suggest is that we'll go in reverse order from the initial speaking. So I'm going to go to Kay first, and then we'll finish up with Daniel after going through Delphine and Luke as well. So Kay, over to you. Any response to the questions and your closing thoughts, please?
I think perhaps just for the sake of time, a brief comment to say that yes, we do understand that the budget is technical, and particularly more so in certain areas than others. And we also understand that it's a process that at certain stages, has secrecy involved and so on, given it can have impacts on financial markets and that sort of thing. However, the budget process has to go wider than that. And certainly at the end of the day, it is about people, and budget games might be played inadvertently to balance the books, the sheer pressure of the job, or it might be a tactic that's planned, but certainly bringing in more of the actors in the budget process and bringing them in a way to have a discussion about trade-offs is the way that we have to look towards solving these problems in the future.
Great.
So on fiscal rules, I think it's a very good question. And I think what we underline in the Spending Better framework is the need for clarity on the fiscal strategy of the government, and the need for political endorsement of the fiscal strategy. And whether this means that there needs to be a fiscal rule in the legal framework is another question. And actually, I was saying that a few countries in the OECD do not have fiscal rules. Some of these countries have a fairly good implementation track of their fiscal strategy. So I would say fiscal rules are not necessary, but they are also a very good way of giving clarity. However, we observe in the OECD countries that there has been a multiplication of fiscal rules, sometimes 5, 6 fiscal rules, a debt rule, a budget balance rule, expenditure rules. And definitely when you have 6, 7, 8 fiscal rules, the kind of clarity you want to achieve with your fiscal strategy might not be achieved. So I wouldn't say they are absolutely necessary, but they can help, but they also have to meet a certain number of criteria, including clarity, understandability by the public and by the markets. On the fact that we have technical solutions to people problem, I think it's a very good comment you've made, Tim. And I just want to underline that at the OECD, we are very aware of the fact that the communication, engagement with the citizens, with the wider community and stakeholders is very much part of the equation of solving the current fiscal challenges we have at the moment. I was mentioning in my presentation that we need to do more on communicating to the public the long-term fiscal challenges, and we intend to really work on that. By leveraging the work we do in general on public governance, trust in government, communicating to citizens, and try to apply it to the fiscal space. So this is something where there will be more work from us in coming years.
Okay, thank you very much. Very briefly on the various questions, I agree that with Delphine that the credibility of the rules do not depend only on design. That's for sure. But when you have a poor design, you cannot have a credible rule. So I would say, seen from the perspective of countries in Africa, the median ceiling for the debt rule is 70% in Africa, where the median debt ratio is 60%. So you already see a little bit, this debt ratio has been set at a level that was in a sense not binding really for African economies. So because the thresholds were not credible, then the rules are not really used. So I agree with what you said, but I think at least the calibration is also important. Then regarding the question of the tension between cutting capex on one hand and investing in climate needs on the other hand, yes, it's a tension, but I think our recommendation here, and we produced in the context of our last regional economic outlook, a chapter on that. The solution is actually that the climate, at least spending in Africa, I'm not talking about other regions, should mainly come from concessional financing. We're not saying that this should finance through budgets and domestic revenues. And especially what we discussed in this note is that there is a big potential from climate funds that is untapped in Africa. A lot of money there, and African economies barely tap it for various reasons that I could explain. On whether IMF and World Bank have the right size for support, I can just talk about the IMF. I think what we are doing at the moment is trying to expand the size of our fund for low-income countries called the PRGT. One issue that we have is that the money that we receive from the international community is provided, these are loans provided at our SDR rate, but then we on-lend them at 0%. So there is a cost, which we call the subsidy, which needs to be covered. And there is a campaign right now to try to get this money. And we also got some money from the recycling of the SDRs of advanced economies. So this is ongoing. But whether the IMF needs to increase, yeah, it needs to increase, yes. And finally, regarding your question on the people's problem, not just technical, I like the way you present it. I would just frame it in the context of African economies, where I think the issue really is trust in these economies. It's especially what you see today in the Sahel and the fragile countries. There is a structural lack of trust in the capacity of the government to provide public services, and it creates a very negative loop in which there is no trust. So basically, the population the tax compliance is very low, so you cannot provide public services, and then there is it reinforces the lack of trust. So how you break this loop, I think, is extremely important. How you create trust in public services, and perhaps you need at the beginning to have better public services to basically unlock this positive loop. Thank you.
Thank you. I think without repeating what my colleagues have said, just mention something about the maturing Eurobond next year. The general message that the government is sending is that we are not in a very good fiscal environment, and it's likely to become worse before things become better. So inevitably, I think we tighten our belt when Eurobond falls due. But at least for this time, there are more progressive reforms, as is indicated by the medium-term revenue strategy and the national tax policy. That is likely to expand the revenue base. We have an ambitious target of increasing revenue by 16%. Historically, that has never happened. Usually it's about 4%, 5% growth. So we'll see when it comes, whether the 16% is something we can pull off within a year. Thank you for having me.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you all. So we started off this morning reflecting on maybe we need to pity the finance minister, and I'm not sure we've done anything to help kind of assist them, but I think we've raised an interesting set of questions that do need to be taken forward, which is how to make fiscal commitments stick, how to make them credible. Do what look like on paper good PFM processes always lead to good outcomes? And how do we make sure that these institutional reforms actually change the behavior of the policymakers and others around them in the budget processes? We've also raised, which I think this is a kind of, some of those are old questions, but I think this just reinforces that we are still looking for good answers to them. And we've also had questions about the international support that is needed. And I would highlight that tomorrow we have a session specifically looking at that. And I'm sure we will come to the question of whether the PRGT has got the resources it needs to provide countries with the support they need. So I don't want to hold us back from lunch anymore. Please, can we try and get back as close to 2 o'clock as possible? And we'll be strict on pushing you all in. And please, can you give our speakers another deserved round of applause? Thank you.